Eleanor Hale stood on the Denver platform clutching a telegram that had arrived 3 days after the funeral, a funeral she hadn't been invited to, for an uncle she'd met exactly once. The words blurred through her tears. You are sole heir to the Hale Ranch, eastern Colorado. Lawyer awaits your arrival in Bent Creek. She had $17 to her name, hands that knew only needle and thread, and absolutely no idea how to run a cattle ranch. Behind her, Boston and its suffocating poverty. Ahead, a land that killed the unprepared. She stepped onto the westbound train anyway because sometimes dying while trying beats dying while surrendering. Welcome to Eleanor's story of survival, transformation, and the unexpected love that blooms in the hardest soil. If this resonates with you, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the miles. Now let's begin where all great changes start, with a single, terrifying choice. The train lurched westward through landscapes Eleanor had only read about in dime novels, each mile carrying her further from everything familiar and deeper into a future she couldn't imagine. She pressed her forehead against the window, watching Boston's brick tenements give way to farmland, then to endless rolling plains that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. The other passengers changed with the landscape. Well-dressed merchants and their wives disembarked at Hartford and Philadelphia, replaced by farmers in worn denim and women with sun-weathered faces and capable hands. By the time they crossed into Ohio, Eleanor was acutely aware of how she stood out, her black morning dress too fine for practicality, her hands too pale and soft, her entire bearing screaming city girl to anyone who cared to look. She tried not to think about what awaited her. A ranch, cattle, land she'd never seen, left by a man who'd been a stranger. Uncle Theodore had visited Boston once, when Eleanor was 7. She remembered a tall man with windburned cheeks who'd looked uncomfortable in the narrow streets, who'd spoken little and left after 2 days. Her mother had called him peculiar. Her father, before the factory accident took him, had called Theodore a dreamer who'd gone west chasing fool's gold and found dirt instead. Now that dirt was hers. The telegram had found her in Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, where Eleanor worked 16 hours a day as a seamstress, her fingers perpetually pricked and aching, her eyes strained from working by lamplight to meet impossible deadlines. The work barely covered her rent and kept her fed on bread and watery soup. There was no future in it, no hope of anything better, just the slow grind of survival until her eyes gave out or her hands refused to work, or some illness carried her off like it had taken her mother 2 winters past. The lawyer's letter had been brief and businesslike. Theodore Hale had died of pneumonia in February. He'd left no will, but county records showed Eleanor as his only living relative. The ranch, such as it was, belonged to her now. She could sell it, the lawyer noted, though he warned that finding a buyer might take time. The property was remote and in need of significant work. Eleanor had read that letter 17 times, sitting on her narrow bed in the boarding house's attic, before making her decision. She'd sold everything she owned except the clothes in her carpet bag, given Mrs. Caldwell notice, and used her savings to purchase a one-way ticket west. What else was there? Another decade of sewing until her fingers cramped permanently? A desperate marriage to some factory worker who'd see her as free labor in a warm body? The charity ward when age or illness finally caught her? At least the ranch offered a choice, even if that choice killed her. 3 days into the journey, somewhere in the vast emptiness of Kansas, a woman sat down across from Eleanor. She was perhaps 40, dressed practically in brown calico, her face lined by sun and wind, but her eyes sharp and assessing. "First time west?" she asked without preamble. Eleanor nodded, suddenly self-conscious of her fine morning dress. "Thought so. You've got that look about you, like a hothouse flower wondering what hit it when the first frost comes." The woman's tone wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. "Where you headed?" "Bent Creek, Colorado." The woman's eyebrows rose. "Bent Creek? That's cattle country, hard country. You got people there?" "I inherited a ranch." The words felt absurd in Eleanor's mouth. "Did you now?" The woman studied her for a long moment. "You know anything about ranching?" "No." "Cattle?" "No." "Frontier living?" Eleanor shook her head, fighting the urge to cry. The woman sighed. "Well, at least you're honest. That might keep you alive longer than false confidence would. She extended her hand. Martha Brennan. My husband and I run a ranch north of Denver. Eleanor Hale. The handshake was firm, almost painful. Martha's hands were calloused and strong. Listen to me, Eleanor Hale. The frontier doesn't care about your good intentions or your hard luck. It doesn't offer second chances just because you mean well. You'll need to learn fast, work harder than you ever have, and ask for help when you need it. Pride kills out here faster than blizzards. I'm not proud, Eleanor said quietly. I'm just desperate. Martha's expression softened slightly. Desperation can make you strong or stupid. Try for strong. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small book, its cover worn from use. Take this. Basic Ranching Guide. It won't teach you everything, but it's a start. Read it before you arrive. Eleanor accepted the book with trembling hands. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me if you're still alive come winter. Martha stood as the train began to slow for the next stop. One more thing. Don't try to do everything alone. Find someone who knows the land and isn't too proud to teach. Even paying for lessons is better than dying ignorant. Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd at the platform, leaving Eleanor with a book and advice that sounded more like a dire warning. Eleanor opened the guide that night in a Denver boarding house, reading by candlelight about cattle breeds and grazing patterns, about fence maintenance and water rights, about predators and weather, and 1,000 details she'd never considered. Each page made the enormity of her situation more apparent. She knew nothing, less than nothing. She was walking into a life that required skills she didn't possess, knowledge she'd never needed, strength she wasn't sure she had. But she kept reading because what else could she do? The final leg of the journey took her southeast from Denver on a smaller local train that rattled and swayed over rough tracks. The other passengers were few now, mostly cowboys and farmers who spoke in laconic drawls and looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The landscape grew more rugged, rolling plains giving way to scattered buttes and the distant purple shadows of mountains. Bent Creek, when they finally arrived, wasn't even really a town. A handful of weathered buildings clustered around the train stop, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and what might have been a hotel or boarding house. Everything looked temporary, as if a strong wind might scatter it all across the prairie. The platform was empty except for an elderly man in a dusty suit who approached as Eleanor stepped down, carpetbag in hand. Miss Hale? I'm Samuel Worth. I sent you the telegram. The lawyer looked exhausted, like a man who'd seen too much hard country and not enough success. They shook hands briefly. Thank you for meeting me. It's a small town. News of your arrival preceded you. Worth gestured toward a wagon hitched nearby. I've arranged transportation to the ranch. It's about 12 miles northeast. We should leave now if we want to arrive before dark. Eleanor climbed into the wagon, her city boots slipping on the worn step. Worth took the reins without comment, and they rattled out of town on a road that was barely more than wheel ruts through the grass. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the endless wind. Finally, Worth spoke. Your uncle was a good man. Quiet, kept to himself mostly, but honest in his dealings. The ranch isn't large, about 600 acres, maybe 300 head of cattle at last count. The house is sound enough. He left you some money, too. About $400 in the bank. Not a fortune, but it'll keep you through winter if you're careful. $400. To Eleanor, who'd never had more than $20 at once, it sounded like wealth beyond measure. To a rancher, she suspected, it was barely survival. Did he have help? Hired hands? Worth shook his head. Ran it himself, mostly. Had a neighbor who helped with roundup and branding. Theodore was one of those self-sufficient types. Didn't trust easily. Didn't ask for help unless he had no choice. It probably killed him in the end. Pneumonia took him fast, but he might have survived if he'd called for help sooner. The implications settled over Eleanor like a cold blanket. Self-sufficient. Alone. Dead because he wouldn't ask for help. She couldn't afford that kind of pride. They crested a low rise and Worth pulled the wagon to a stop. There, he said simply, pointing. The ranch spread before her in the golden late afternoon light. A small house, weathered gray by sun and wind, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, several outbuildings in various states of repair, and corrals built from rough-hewn wood. Beyond it all stretched open rangeland dotted with cattle, their dark shapes scattered across the grass like seeds thrown by a careless hand. It looked impossibly lonely, beautiful in its starkness, but so isolated it made Eleanor's chest tight. The nearest neighbor is the Turner Ranch, about 4 miles north, Worth continued. Caleb Turner. He's the one who found Theodore and rode to town for the doctor. He's been checking on the stock since your uncle died, making sure nothing went wrong before you arrived. Good man, though he keeps to himself. They descended toward the ranch in silence. As they drew closer, Eleanor could see the signs of neglect: sagging fence posts, weeds growing tall around the house, a broken window covered with oiled paper. But the bones were good. The house was solid, the barn functional, the land itself stretching away in every direction like a promise or a threat, depending on how you looked at it. Worth pulled up in front of the house and helped Eleanor down. Her legs trembled from the long journey, from exhaustion and fear and the sheer overwhelming reality of this place that was now hers. Keys are inside on the kitchen table. Theodore never locked up. Nobody does out here. Too isolated for thieves, and anyone traveling through is usually welcomed for the company. Worth handed her a folder of papers. Deeds in there, bank information, property boundaries. If you need legal help settling the estate, send word to town. Otherwise, he paused, studying her with something like concern. Otherwise, Miss Hale, I wish you the very best of luck. You're going to need it. He tipped his hat and drove away, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the yard with her single carpet bag and a future she had no idea how to face. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and dust and something else. Cattle, she realized. Grass and animals and wide open spaces. It was nothing like Boston's coal smoke and horse manure, and unwashed humanity pressed too close together. She picked up her bag and walked to the house. Inside was dim and spare. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, 2 small bedrooms, and furnishings that looked handmade and purely functional. Everything was coated in dust, but it was clean dust, if that made sense. The kind that came from disuse, not filth. Eleanor set her bag down and walked through each room, trying to feel some connection to the uncle who'd lived here, who'd died here. There were few personal items, some books on a shelf, mostly technical manuals about cattle and land management. A daguerreotype on the mantel showing a younger Theodore standing stiffly beside a woman Eleanor didn't recognize. No letters, no diaries, no hint of the man's inner life. He'd lived simply and alone and left behind a legacy he never knew she'd inherit. She found the keys on the table as Worth had said, along with a handwritten note. Cattle need checking daily. Watch the north fence. It's weak. Creek runs year-round but gets low in August. Good luck. T.H. Even in death, her uncle was practical. No sentimentality, no emotion, just the facts she'd need to survive. Eleanor walked out onto the porch as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The cattle were settling in for the night, their lowing carried on the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The sky was turning colors she'd never seen, brilliant oranges and purples and golds that painted the clouds like a masterpiece. It was beautiful, terrifying, impossibly vast. She had no idea what she was doing. The panic hit her then, really hit her for the first time since she'd made this decision. She sank down on the porch steps, her breath coming in short gasps. What had she done? She couldn't run a ranch. She didn't know the first thing about cattle or fencing or any of this. She was going to fail, lose everything, probably die out here alone just like Theodore had. She pressed her hands to her face, fighting tears that came anyway. You lost, or just contemplating a bad decision? Eleanor's head snapped up. A man sat on a horse about 20 feet away. She had no idea how long he'd been there or how she'd missed his approach. He was perhaps 30, dressed in worn denim and a dusty hat, his face shadowed in the fading light. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, assessing her with the same practical evaluation she might give a piece of fabric to determine its quality. I'm not lost, Eleanor managed, standing quickly and wiping at her eyes. This is my property. I know who you are. Eleanor Hale, Theodore's niece from Boston. The man dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. I'm Caleb Turner, your neighbor to the north. This was the man Worth had mentioned, the one who'd found Theodore, the one who'd been checking the cattle. Thank you for looking after things, Eleanor said, trying to compose herself. She must look a mess, red-eyed, dusty, completely out of her element. Caleb tied his horse to the porch rail and walked closer. In the better light, Eleanor could see he was younger than she'd first thought, maybe not yet 30, with dark hair and weathered skin and eyes that missed very little. There was something self-contained about him, a quiet competence that reminded her of Martha Brennan on the train. Wasn't much looking after to do. Theodore kept things simple, easy to maintain. He studied the house, the barn, then turned that assessing gaze back to her. You know anything about ranching? Eleanor considered lying, then remembered Martha's advice. No, nothing. Caleb nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. How about horses? Can you ride? No. Handle cattle? No. Mend fence? Manage water rights? Recognize illness in livestock? No, no, and no. Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to be ashamed of her ignorance. I was a seamstress in Boston. I can sew a straight seam and work 16 hours without stopping, but I don't know the first thing about this life. I'm aware of how unprepared I am. At least you're honest. Caleb echoed Martha's words almost exactly. That's better than most greenhorns who show up thinking they've got it all figured out. I don't have anything figured out, Eleanor admitted. I barely have a plan beyond not starving to death. A ghost of a smile crossed Caleb's face. That's a start. Basic survival is a good first goal. He glanced at the setting sun. It's getting dark. You have supplies? Food? Eleanor thought of her empty carpet bag. No, not yet. Caleb walked to his horse and untied a burlap sack from his saddle. Figured as much. Bread, some cheese, dried beef, coffee. It'll get you through tonight and tomorrow. After that, you'll need to get to the general store in Bent Creek or learn to cook what you can hunt. He handed her the sack and their hands brushed briefly. His were calloused and warm, scarred across the knuckles. Working hands, capable hands. Thank you, Eleanor said quietly. I don't know how to repay. Don't. Caleb's voice was sharp. Don't start tallying debts and favors. Out here, neighbors help each other because next time it might be you doing the helping. That's how it works. Eleanor nodded, chastened but also oddly reassured. There were rules here, different from Boston's transactional charity, but rules nonetheless. I should go, Caleb said, moving back toward his horse. But I'll be straight with you, Miss Hale. You're in trouble. This ranch can't run itself, and you don't have the skills to run it. Theodore managed because he grew up on this land, learned from his father, spent 40 years building knowledge. You're starting from zero with winter coming in 4 months. I know. Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. What do you suggest? Caleb mounted his horse, looking down at her from the saddle. You've got 3 choices as I see it. 1, sell the place. Take your money and go back east, build a different life. 2, hire someone who knows ranching to run it for you, though finding good help is hard and expensive. 3, learn, fast. Work harder than you've ever worked, make mistakes, probably get hurt, and hope you survive the learning curve. Which would you choose? Doesn't matter what I'd choose. It matters what you can live with. He turned his horse toward the north. I'll check back in a few days. Make sure you haven't died of something stupid. In the meantime, stay away from the cattle unless you know what you're doing. They're not pets. He rode away into the gathering darkness, leaving Eleanor alone with a sack of food and 3 impossible choices. She went inside, lit a lamp with matches she found by the stove, and unpacked Caleb's supplies. The bread was still soft, the cheese sharp and good. She ate sitting at the kitchen table, her uncle's note still lying there beside the keys, and tried to think clearly through her exhaustion and fear. Sell, hire, learn. Selling would be the smart choice. Take the money. Return to Boston or try somewhere new. Find work as a seamstress in a better situation. She could probably save enough to open her own small shop eventually, build a modest but stable life. But the thought of returning to that existence, the cramped rooms, the endless sewing, the slow suffocation of a life that led nowhere, made her chest tight. She'd escaped that. Stumbled into an escape, yes, but still. Going back felt like admitting defeat before she'd even tried. Hiring someone meant maintaining distance from the actual work, remaining ignorant and dependent. She'd be an owner in name only, vulnerable to anyone who wanted to take advantage. And the expense? How long would $400 last paying a ranch manager? That left learning. Eleanor looked around the simple kitchen at the life her uncle had carved out in this hard country. He'd survived here for decades. If she was his blood, maybe she had some of that same stubborn resilience buried somewhere inside her. She was good at learning. She'd taught herself fine needlework from books, had memorized patterns and techniques until her hands moved with unconscious precision. She could work long hours. She'd proved that every day in Boston. She wasn't afraid of hardship exactly. She was afraid of failing, yes, but hardship itself? She'd lived with that her whole life. The question was whether she could learn fast enough to survive her own ignorance. Eleanor pulled out Martha Brennan's ranching guide and began reading by lamplight, taking notes on scraps of paper she found in a drawer. Cattle needed water, grass, salt. They needed checking for illness and injury. Fences needed regular inspection and repair. There were seasons for different tasks, branding in spring, roundup in fall. 1,000 details she'd need to master. She read until the lamp oil ran low and her eyes burned, then stumbled to one of the bedrooms. Her uncle's room, she realized, seeing the simple bed and empty dresser. She lay down fully clothed on top of the blankets, too tired to care about propriety or comfort. Sleep came hard. The silence was overwhelming after Boston's constant noise. Every creak of the house made her jump. The wind rattled the windows. Somewhere outside, an animal called, coyote or owl or something else she didn't know. This was her life now. This isolation, this responsibility, this terrifying freedom. She'd have to become someone new to survive it, someone strong enough to live in this hard country, someone capable and self-reliant and brave. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to believe she could become that person. Morning arrived with harsh sunlight and the lowing of cattle. Eleanor woke disoriented, her body aching from travel and tension, her mouth dry. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, then it all came rushing back. The ranch, Colorado, her inheritance. She rose stiffly and went to the kitchen, trying to remember how to work the cast iron stove. It took 3 attempts to get a fire started, and she nearly burned herself twice, but eventually she managed to heat water for washing and make coffee from Caleb's supplies. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the weak tea she'd drunk in Boston. It burned her throat and made her eyes water, but it also cleared her head and gave her courage. She needed a plan. Not a grand strategy for the whole future, just a plan for today. First, explore the property. Understand what she actually owned. Second, check the cattle, whatever that meant. Third, make a list of everything she didn't know and needed to learn. Eleanor changed into her simplest dress, still too fine for ranch work, but the best she had, and ventured outside. The ranch looked different in daylight. Still isolated, still overwhelming, but beautiful in a stark way. The grassland rolled away in gentle swells, dotted with cattle that grazed peacefully in the morning cool. The mountains were visible to the west, their peaks still snow-capped despite the late spring warmth. The sky was an impossible blue, unmarred by smoke or clouds. She walked toward the barn first. Inside, she found stalls for horses, currently empty, and equipment she couldn't identify. Ropes and tools and leather things hanging from hooks. Everything dusty but organized, as if Theodore had kept his workspace neat even in death. No horses, though. That seemed like a problem. How was she supposed to check cattle or mend fences without a horse? Eleanor found a small notebook in the barn and began making lists. Questions she needed answered. Skills she needed to learn. Supplies she might need. The list grew quickly, overwhelming in its length. She was so absorbed in her note-taking that she didn't hear the approaching horse until it was nearly at the barn door. "Starting your education, I see." Caleb Turner stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning. He looked like he'd already done a full day's work. Dusty, slightly sweaty, completely at ease. "I'm making lists," Eleanor said, feeling defensive. "Trying to understand what I don't know." "That could be a very long list." Caleb walked into the barn, his boots echoing on the hard-packed floor. He glanced at her notebook. "Where are Theodore's horses?" "I was wondering the same thing." "He had 2, Old Doc and a mare named Sally." I've been keeping them at my place since he died. Didn't make sense to leave them here with nobody to care for them. Caleb studied her. You planning to stay then? Haven't decided to sell. I'm planning to try. Eleanor met his gaze directly. Whether I succeed is another question, but I'm going to try. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Respect, maybe, or at least acknowledgement that she wasn't going to run at the first difficulty. Then you'll need to learn, he said, fast and thorough, and you'll need help whether you want it or not. I know. Martha Brennan on the train told me the same thing. Don't let pride kill me. Smart woman. Caleb leaned against a stall door, considering her. Here's what I'm offering. I'll teach you what you need to know. Ranch work, cattle handling, fence repair, basic survival skills. I'll bring back your uncle's horses and show you how to care for them and ride. I'll help you get this place running properly. Relief flooded through Eleanor. Thank you. I can pay. No. The word was flat and final. Eleanor blinked. What? No payment. No money changing hands. Caleb's voice was firm. This is neighbor helping neighbor, like I said last night. You try to make it a business transaction, it becomes something different, something less. But that's not fair to you. Your time, your expertise. Fair? Caleb almost smiled. Miss Hale, fairness doesn't enter into it. Your uncle helped me when I first started my ranch, taught me about water rights and grass management. He never asked for payment either. Said knowledge should be shared freely, especially in hard country where ignorance kills. I'm doing the same for you. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. I don't know how to accept that kind of generosity. You just say yes and work hard. That's how you accept it. Caleb pushed away from the stall door. But I'm warning you now, I won't be gentle. I won't slow down because you're tired or scared or your hands hurt. This land doesn't give you that kind of mercy, so I won't either. You'll work until you understand, and if you don't understand, you'll work some more until you do. I can handle hard work. I've been working hard my whole life. City hard work, Caleb said, sitting at a table sewing. This is different. This will break you down and build you back up different. You sure you want that? Eleanor thought about the alternative. Selling, leaving, returning to the slow death of her old life. I'm sure. Then we start now. Get your boots on and meet me at the north pasture in 5 minutes. He walked out before she could respond, leaving Eleanor standing in the barn with her notebook and her racing heart. This was it, the beginning of her real education, the first step toward becoming someone who belonged in this country instead of just surviving in it. She set down the notebook and went to face whatever lesson Caleb had planned, terrified and determined in equal measure. The future would be hard, she knew that. But for the first time since receiving that telegram in Boston, Eleanor felt something like hope stirring beneath the fear. She wasn't alone. She had help. She had a chance. Now she just had to prove she could take it. The north pasture stretched before Eleanor like an ocean of grass, dotted with cattle that looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Caleb stood near the fence line, one boot propped on the lower rail. His posture relaxed, but his eyes constantly scanning the herd. First lesson, he said as Eleanor approached, her city boots already dusty from the walk. Learn to see what's actually there, not what you think should be there. Look at those cattle. What do you notice? Eleanor studied the animals, trying to find something meaningful to say. They were brown and black, some with white markings. They had horns. They were eating grass. They look healthy? That's a guess, not an observation. Caleb pointed toward a cow near the edge of the group. That one there, the red heifer with the white face. See how she's standing separate from the others, head down lower than it should be? Eleanor squinted. Now that he'd pointed it out, she could see the difference. Subtle, but there. The cow's posture was slightly off, less alert than her companions. What does that mean? Could mean nothing. Could mean she's getting sick or injured or about to calve. Point is, you can't know until you check. Out here, you learn to spot the small things before they become big problems. Caleb vaulted over the fence with easy grace. Come on. Eleanor looked at the fence. 4 rails of rough wood, the top one at least 4 feet high. I can't climb that in this dress. Then you're wearing the wrong clothes. Caleb's voice was matter of fact, not unkind. You'll need practical gear, denim trousers if you can manage it, or at least a split skirt. Sturdy boots, not those. He nodded at her leather city boots. But for now, use the gate. Her face burned as she walked 50 feet to the gate, fumbled with the unfamiliar latch, and stepped through. By the time she reached Caleb, he was already approaching the separated cow, moving slowly and talking in a low, steady voice. "Easy now, Mama. Just want to take a look. Easy." The cow watched him warily, but didn't bolt. Caleb moved closer, his hands visible and non-threatening, until he was near enough to touch her. His hands moved over her side, gentle but thorough, while he kept up that constant low murmur. "She's fine," he said finally, stepping back. "Just chose a quiet spot to chew her cud. But you see how I approached her? Slow, steady, talking the whole time. Cattle are prey animals. They spook easy. You come at them fast or loud, they'll run or charge, and either way someone gets hurt." Eleanor watched him move among the herd now, checking others with the same calm efficiency. The cattle barely reacted to his presence, as if he were just another feature of the landscape. "How many are there?" she asked. Theodore had about 300 head last count. Some have probably calved since then, and will lose a few to predators or illness over the season. You'll need to do a proper count soon. Get the numbers straight in your mind. 300 cattle. The number felt incomprehensible. How do you keep track of them all? You learn to recognize them, their markings, their personalities. That big bull there, the black one with the scarred shoulder, that's Thunder. He's the dominant bull, keeps the others in line. The paint cow with the crooked horn is Sadie. She's old, probably won't make it through another winter. You get to know them. Caleb turned to face her fully. Now you try. Walk into the herd. Show me what you learned. Eleanor's heart hammered. The cattle suddenly looked much larger up close, their horns sharper, their movements unpredictable. But Caleb was watching, and she'd promised herself she wouldn't fail from cowardice. She took a breath and stepped forward, moving slowly like he'd shown her. "Easy," she murmured, her voice shaking slightly. "Easy now." A nearby cow raised its head, eyes rolling white. Eleanor froze. "Keep moving," Caleb called. "Steady and slow. Stopping makes you look like a predator about to pounce." Eleanor forced herself forward. The cow watched her but didn't run. She moved past it between two others, her whole body tense and waiting for something to go wrong. But the cattle simply shifted away from her, not panicked, just maintaining their preferred distance. "Good," Caleb said when she emerged on the other side. "You're not a natural, but you didn't do anything stupid. That's a start." They spent the next 2 hours walking the pasture, Caleb pointing out details Eleanor would never have noticed on her own. The way healthy cattle moved with their tails relaxed, while sick or stressed animals held them tucked tight. The importance of checking their eyes for clarity, their coats for parasites, their gait for lameness. How to spot a cow about to calve by the way she separated from the herd, and the tension in her flanks. By the time they returned to the fence line, Eleanor's head was spinning with information, and her feet ached from walking in unsuitable boots. Her dress was dusty and stained with grass, probably ruined by city standards, but barely broken in by frontier measures. "That's enough for today," Caleb said, surprising her. "You're already overwhelmed. No point adding more until you've processed what you've learned." "I can keep going," Eleanor protested. "I'm not fragile." "Didn't say you were. But your brain can only hold so much new information at once. Better to learn thoroughly than quickly." Caleb gathered his horse's reins. "Tomorrow morning, same time. I'll bring your uncle's horses and we'll start riding lessons. Meantime, walk the property. Get familiar with every fence line, every structure, every water source. Make maps if it helps. You need to know this land like you know your own hands." He mounted up, then paused, looking down at her. "You did better than I expected, Miss Hale. Most city folk would have run screaming when that cow looked at them sideways." "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted. "Fear keeps you alert. It's when you stop being afraid that you get careless and hurt." He touched his hat brim. "See you tomorrow." Eleanor watched him ride north toward his own ranch, then turned to look at the property that was somehow hers. The cattle grazed peacefully, the grass rippled in the wind, the sun climbed higher in a cloudless sky. It was beautiful and harsh and utterly foreign. She spent the afternoon walking the fence lines like Caleb had suggested, noting places where posts leaned or wire sagged. She found the creek he'd mentioned, running clear and cold through a shallow ravine, and understood immediately why this land had value. Water in dry country meant life. She explored the outbuildings, finding tools she couldn't name and supplies she didn't know how to use. By evening, her legs trembled with exhaustion and her stomach growled with hunger. She made a simple meal from Caleb's supplies, ate alone at the kitchen table, and fell into bed as soon as darkness came. The next morning arrived too soon. Eleanor woke to the sound of horses and found Caleb in the yard with 3 animals, his own mount and 2 others, an older gelding with kind eyes and a younger mare who danced nervously at the end of her lead rope. "This is Doc," Caleb said, indicating the gelding. "He's patient and steady, good for learning. And this troublemaker is Sally. She's got spirit, but she's sound. Your uncle preferred her for working cattle." Eleanor approached Doc slowly, remembering yesterday's lessons about calm movement. The horse lowered his head and huffed warm breath against her palm. "He likes you," Caleb observed. "That's good. Makes the learning easier." He handed her a brush. "First lesson before you ever get on a horse, learn to care for one. Grooming builds trust and lets you check for injuries. Start at his neck and work back. Firm strokes. Watch for any tender spots." The grooming took longer than Eleanor expected. Caleb showed her how to pick out hooves, checking for stones or infection, how to examine legs for heat or swelling, how to run her hands over the horse's body, feeling for anything wrong. Doc stood patiently through it all, occasionally turning his head to watch her with what looked like benign tolerance. "Now we saddle," Caleb said, hauling a worn saddle from the barn. "Pay attention. You'll be doing this yourself by tomorrow." He walked her through each step, the blanket positioned just right, the saddle settling into place, the girth tightened gradually to avoid pinching. There were buckles and straps, and a vocabulary Eleanor struggled to follow. Cinch, latigo, fender, stirrup. Her head spun. "Repeat it back to me," Caleb ordered. Eleanor tried, stumbling over the sequence, getting corrections at every step. They went through it 3 times before Caleb nodded approval. "Good enough for now. Mount up." Eleanor stared at the saddle, which suddenly looked impossibly high. "How?" Caleb demonstrated on his own horse. Foot in stirrup, hand on the horn, swing up and over in one smooth motion. He made it look effortless. Eleanor's first attempt ended with her hopping on one foot, unable to pull herself up. Her second attempt got her halfway before she lost her grip and stumbled backward. Her face burned with embarrassment. "You're trying to muscle it," Caleb said. "Use momentum. Spring up as you pull." On the 4th try, Eleanor made it into the saddle, though with none of Caleb's grace. She sat there breathing hard, feeling the horse's warmth beneath her, the height, and the strange shifting sensation as Doc adjusted his weight. "Good. Now comes the hard part." Caleb mounted his own horse. Learning to actually ride. The morning dissolved into the most physically demanding work Eleanor had ever experienced. Caleb taught her how to hold the reins, how to use her legs to signal the horse, how to sit properly so she moved with the animal instead of fighting it. They walked in circles around the yard until Eleanor's thighs burned and her back ached. When she finally managed to trot, the jolting motion nearly unseated her 3 times before she found the rhythm. "Enough," Caleb called after what felt like hours. "Any more and you won't be able to walk tomorrow." He was right. When Eleanor dismounted, her legs nearly gave out. She caught herself on the saddle, breathing hard, every muscle screaming. "You'll be sore," Caleb said, not unkindly. "Real sore, but it gets easier. Your body adapts." He showed her how to unsaddle Doc, how to rub him down and check his hooves again, how to turn him into the corral with fresh water and feed. "Same time tomorrow," Caleb said. "We'll ride the property, check the full herd. You'll need to know every corner of this ranch." Eleanor nodded, too exhausted to speak. She spent that afternoon soaking her hands in cold water from the pump and trying not to think about the blisters forming. Her whole body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. The seamstress work had been repetitive and tiring, but this was different, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from using muscles she'd never properly developed. But beneath the pain was something else, a strange satisfaction. She'd gotten on a horse. She'd stayed on, mostly. She'd learned something real and difficult and useful. The days blurred together after that. Morning lessons with Caleb, afternoons exploring and working on small tasks around the ranch, evenings studying the ranching guide by lamplight until she couldn't keep her eyes open. Eleanor learned to mend fence, driving posts into hard ground until her hands bled, and Caleb made her stop to wrap them. She learned to read the sky for weather, to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. She learned which plants cattle could eat and which were poison, learned to spot predator tracks in the soft earth near the creek. Caleb was true to his word about not being gentle. When Eleanor made mistakes, he corrected her sharply and made her repeat the task until she got it right. When she complained about being tired, he reminded her that cattle didn't care about her comfort. When she wanted to quit for the day, he pushed her to do one more thing, learn one more skill. But he also showed unexpected kindness. He brought supplies from town without being asked, proper work boots that actually fit, a split riding skirt that scandalized Eleanor until she realized how much easier it made everything, gloves to protect her already damaged hands. He never mentioned payment, and when Eleanor tried to repay him, he simply rode away. "You're prideful," Eleanor accused one morning as they rode the fence line together, checking for breaks. "Says the woman who worked herself bloody rather than ask for help," Caleb replied without heat. "That's different. I didn't want to seem weak. And I don't want to seem like I need payment for being a decent neighbor. We're both stubborn. The difference is, my stubbornness keeps you alive." He pointed toward a broken post. "There. See it?" They spent an hour repairing the fence, Caleb showing Eleanor how to dig out the old post, set a new one, and string the wire tight. Her hands ached despite the gloves, and sweat ran down her back in the June heat, but she kept working until the job was done properly. "You're getting stronger," Caleb observed as they rode back toward the house. "Less clumsy. Your hands are building calluses." Eleanor looked at her palms, rough now and marked with small scars. They looked nothing like her seamstress hands had, pale and delicate despite the constant needle pricks. These were working hands, frontier hands. "How long before I can manage on my own?" she asked. Caleb considered the question seriously. "Depends what you mean by manage. You can check cattle now without getting yourself killed, and you can ride well enough to cover ground. Fencing's coming along. But there's still branding, roundup, winter preparation, dealing with illness and injury in the herd, managing predators, business decisions about when to sell and what to buy. You've learned survival basics. The rest takes years." "I don't have years. I have until winter." "Then you work harder and hope it's enough." Caleb pulled his horse to a stop near Eleanor's porch. "But you should know, you're doing better than I expected. Most city folk would have quit by now or gotten themselves killed trying. You're stubborn enough to maybe make it." Coming from Caleb, it was high praise. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this. I know you say it's just neighborly, but it's more than that. You're giving me a chance at a real future." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a softening around his eyes. "Your uncle gave me the same chance. Only seems right to pass it along." He gathered his reins. "Tomorrow we work on separating cattle from the herd. It's tricky work, but you'll need it for branding." He rode off before Eleanor could respond, leaving her standing in the yard wondering about the man who'd become the center of her new life, this quiet cowboy who gave so much and asked for nothing in return. The weeks rolled on, and Eleanor felt herself changing in ways that went beyond the physical. Her body grew lean and strong from constant work. Her skin tanned despite her attempts to stay covered. Her hands became capable of things she'd never imagined. Roping a calf, delivering a breech birth with Caleb's guidance, shooting a rifle to scare off coyotes circling too close to the herd. But the internal changes ran deeper. She stopped being afraid of the silence, of the vast empty spaces. She learned to find comfort in solitude, to appreciate the rhythm of days marked by work and weather rather than clocks and factory whistles. The ranch stopped feeling like a prison of isolation and started feeling like a sanctuary, and she stopped being afraid of Caleb Turner. It happened gradually, this shift from seeing him as a necessary teacher to something else. She began to notice small things, the way he smiled when a lesson went well, rare but genuine. The patience in his voice when he explained something for the third time. The strength in his hands when he helped her lift something heavy. And the careful way he touched the animals, gentle, despite his size and capability. He was kind, she realized. Beneath the stern exterior and sharp corrections, Caleb Turner was fundamentally kind in a way that had nothing to do with softness and everything to do with caring whether people suffered or succeeded. "You're staring," Caleb said one afternoon as they rested in the shade of the barn, sharing water from a canteen. Eleanor jerked her gaze away, heat flooding her face. "Sorry, I was just thinking." "About what?" "About how different everything is from Boston. How different I am." She took the canteen when he offered it, their fingers brushing. That small contact sent unexpected awareness through her. "I barely recognize myself anymore." "Is that bad?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. "No, I think it's good. The person I was before wouldn't have survived here. Maybe wouldn't have survived anywhere for much longer." Caleb was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "I know something about becoming someone different, about having to leave behind who you thought you were." It was the most personal thing he'd ever said. Eleanor waited, hoping he'd continue. "I grew up in Missouri," Caleb said finally. "Had a family there, parents, 2 sisters, a younger brother. We had a farm, nothing grand, but it was home. Then the war came, and then after the war came drought and debt. We lost everything. My father couldn't handle it, put a gun to his head one winter morning. My mother took my sisters back east to live with relatives. My brother joined the army. I came west because I couldn't stand to stay in a place that reminded me of everything we'd lost." Eleanor's chest ached at the pain in his voice, carefully controlled but present. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. But my point is, I understand about becoming someone new. Out here, you can be whoever you're strong enough to be. The past doesn't matter as much as what you do today." He stood, brushing dust from his pants. "Come on. Daylight's wasting, and those fences won't check themselves." They rode the northern property line, working in companionable silence. Eleanor had learned that Caleb didn't need constant conversation, that the quiet between them could be peaceful rather than awkward. But today, something felt different, charged with an awareness that made her hyper-conscious of his presence, the way he sat his horse, the sound of his voice when he pointed out a hawk circling overhead, the brief moments when their horses drew close and she could feel the heat radiating from him in the summer sun. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "He's your teacher, your neighbor. He's helping you survive, not courting you." But her heart didn't seem to care about logic. By late July, Eleanor could manage most daily ranch tasks without supervision. She checked the cattle each morning, rode the fence lines regularly, handled minor repairs, and kept detailed records of the herd's health and behavior. Caleb still came by several times a week, but more to advise than to teach, and Eleanor felt both pride in her growing competence and a strange hollowness when he left. Then came the storm. Eleanor saw it building on the western horizon one afternoon, dark clouds massing like an army. She'd learned to read weather signs, and these spoke of violence. She worked quickly to secure anything that might blow away, to move tools under cover, to get the horses into the barn. The wind arrived first, gusting hard enough to tear her hat off and send it tumbling across the yard. Then came the rain, not falling so much as being thrown horizontally by the wind. Lightning split the sky with cracks so loud they hurt her ears, and the cattle panicked. Eleanor heard them through the storm's roar, the sound of hooves thundering, animals calling in distress. She ran toward the pasture, rain immediately soaking her through, and saw chaos. The herd was scattering, spooked by lightning and thunder, heading toward a weak section of fence that wouldn't hold against their weight. She had to turn them, had to get them away from that fence before they broke through and scattered across open range where she'd never recover them all. Eleanor ran for the barn, threw a bridle on Doc, no time for a saddle, and hauled herself onto his bare back. She'd never ridden bareback before, had no idea if she could stay on, but there was no choice. She kicked Doc into a gallop, racing toward the panicked herd. The rain blinded her. The wind tore at her clothes, and lightning struck close enough that she felt the hair on her arms stand up. But she kept riding, yelling at the cattle, trying to turn the leaders away from the fence. A figure appeared through the rain, Caleb on his horse, materializing like a ghost. He shouted something she couldn't hear over the storm. Then they were working together, pushing the cattle, turning them, driving them back toward safer ground. Eleanor felt Doc slip in the mud and grabbed frantically at his mane, somehow keeping her seat. A cow charged past close enough to touch, its eyes rolling white with terror. The lightning never stopped, each flash illuminating a nightmare landscape of wind-lashed grass and panicked animals. Then slowly, the cattle began to settle. The leaders stopped running, and the rest of the herd calmed. Eleanor and Caleb kept circling, keeping them bunched, until the worst of the storm passed and the rain gentled to a steady downpour. "The barn!" Caleb shouted, barely audible. "We need shelter!" They rode back together, got the horses inside, and collapsed against the barn wall as the storm continued to rage outside. Eleanor was shaking, whether from cold or fear or exhaustion she couldn't tell. Her clothes were plastered to her body, her hair hanging in wet ropes, her hands trembling. "That was incredibly stupid," Caleb said, his voice rough. "You could have been killed, thrown from the horse, struck by lightning, trampled by the herd." "The fence wouldn't have held," Eleanor managed through chattering teeth. "I had to try." "You should have waited for help. I was already on my way when I saw the storm building." "I didn't know that." They stared at each other in the dim barn, both breathing hard, the adrenaline still coursing through Eleanor's veins. She saw anger in Caleb's eyes, but also something else. Fear. He'd been afraid for her. "I can't lose another person to this land," Caleb said quietly, the anger draining from his voice. "I can't watch someone else get destroyed by the frontier." "You won't." Eleanor stepped closer, her hand finding his arm. "I'm stronger than I was. You made me stronger. Strong enough to get yourself killed taking risks like that. Strong enough to save my herd, to protect what's mine." She was acutely aware of his nearness, the warmth of his skin under her palm, the way his eyes had darkened to something intense and unreadable. "You taught me that, to fight for what matters." Caleb's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing water from her cheek, rain or tears, she wasn't sure. "When I saw you out there in the storm, I realized something. This stopped being just about teaching you to survive. Somewhere along the way, this became about needing you to survive. For me." Eleanor's breath caught. "Caleb." He kissed her then, soft despite the calluses on his hands, gentle despite the storm still raging outside. Eleanor melted into him, her hands fisting in his wet shirt, her whole body singing with rightness. When they broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't plan this. Didn't want to feel this way about you. It complicates everything." "I know." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "But I feel it too. Have been feeling it for weeks, maybe longer." The storm pounded overhead, trapping them together in the barn shelter. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence between them was full of everything unsaid, fear and hope and desire, and the terrifying vulnerability of admitting that loneliness had found its answer in another person. When the rain finally stopped and the sky began to clear, they emerged into a world washed clean. The ranch looked fresh and green, the cattle calm now, and grazing as if their panic had never happened. Everything was exactly as it had been, except that Eleanor and Caleb were no longer the same people who'd entered the storm. They stood in the yard, neither quite ready to separate, to return to their individual lives. "We should talk about this," Caleb said finally. "About what it means." "Tomorrow," Eleanor replied. "Right now I'm too exhausted to think clearly, and you probably are too." He smiled and it transformed his usually serious face. "Tomorrow then. But Eleanor, I meant what I said. This isn't just about being neighbors anymore." "I know," she said softly. "For me, either." He rode north toward his ranch as the sun broke through the clouds, painting the wet grass gold. Eleanor watched until he disappeared over the ridge, her heart full of something she was almost afraid to name. Everything had changed in that storm. The boundaries between teacher and student, neighbor and friend, had dissolved into something more complicated and infinitely more precious. Eleanor went inside to change into dry clothes, her body aching but her spirit soaring. She'd saved her herd. She'd proven she could handle crisis. And she'd discovered that the competent, quiet cowboy who'd taught her to survive had somehow become essential to the future she was building. Tomorrow, they would talk. They would figure out what this meant, where it could lead, whether two solitary people could build something together that was stronger than what either could create alone. But tonight, Eleanor simply let herself feel the warmth of possibility, the hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found more than land in this inheritance. Maybe she'd found home. Tomorrow came with brilliant sunshine that made the previous day's storm seem like a fever dream. Eleanor woke early, her body protesting the bareback ride and the frantic work in the rain, but her mind clear and focused. She dressed carefully in her work clothes, braided her hair, and tried not to think too hard about what the conversation with Caleb might bring. He arrived mid-morning, riding up to the house with the same steady confidence he always showed, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he dismounted and tied his horse, as if buying himself time to gather his thoughts. "Coffee?" Eleanor offered, stepping onto the porch. "Please." They sat at the kitchen table like they had dozens of times before, but everything felt different now. The air between them hummed with awareness, with the memory of his kiss, with all the words they needed to say. Caleb wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, staring into it like it held answers. "I've been alone a long time," he said finally. "By choice, mostly. After everything that happened in Missouri, after losing my family, it seemed easier not to care too much about anyone. Safer." Eleanor waited, her own coffee cooling in her hands. "But you made that impossible." Caleb looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Watching you work yourself bloody to learn this life. Seeing you refuse to quit even when you were terrified, the way you went out in that storm to save your herd. You made me care whether I wanted to or not." "Is that a bad thing?" Eleanor asked softly. "It's a terrifying thing." Caleb's voice was rough with honesty. "Because caring means risking loss again. It means having something precious that the frontier could take away in a heartbeat." Eleanor set down her cup and reached across the table, taking his scarred hands in hers. "Life takes things away whether we care or not. At least if we care, we have something worth losing." "You sound very wise for someone who arrived here 3 months ago not knowing a cow from a horse." "I had a good teacher." Eleanor smiled. "One who taught me that fear shouldn't stop you from doing what needs to be done." Caleb turned his hands over, threading his fingers through hers. The gesture felt monumental, this simple connection. "I don't know how to do this, Eleanor. I don't know how to court someone properly, or say the pretty things women probably want to hear. I just know that when I thought you might be hurt in that storm, something in my chest cracked open, and I realized I'd been lying to myself about what you meant to me." "Then stop lying." Eleanor's heart was racing, but her voice stayed steady. "Tell me the truth." "The truth is I want you in my life. Not as a neighbor I help occasionally, but as a partner. Someone to share the burden and the beauty of this hard country." Caleb's grip tightened on her hands. "The truth is, I think I'm falling in love with you, and it scares me more than any storm or drought or economic collapse ever could." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from hope rather than pain. "The truth is I feel the same way. I came here expecting to survive or die trying, and instead I found someone who made me want to truly live. You made me believe I could be strong enough for this life, and then you made me want to share that life with you." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped across the table, the weight of their confession settling around them like a blessing. "So what do we do now?" Eleanor asked. "We figure it out together." Caleb stood, pulling her up with him. "We keep working our ranches, keep building our lives, but we do it as a team instead of separately. We court properly, take our time, make sure this is real and lasting." "How long?" Eleanor asked, then flushed. "I'm sorry, that sounds desperate." "It sounds practical." Caleb's thumb traced patterns on her wrist. "Let's give it until fall. That's 3 months to see how we work together, not just as teacher and student, but as equals. If we still feel the same when Roundup's done and winter's approaching, then we talk about making it permanent." Eleanor nodded, recognizing the wisdom in waiting even as part of her wanted to rush headlong into this new certainty. 3 months, and in the meantime? "In the meantime, I court you properly. Dinners together, maybe a dance in town if there's one. Time spent learning who we are beyond the work." Caleb pulled her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face. "And maybe more of this." He kissed her again, longer this time, deeper, and Eleanor felt the world narrow to just this, his warmth, his strength, the rightness of being held by someone who understood what she'd sacrificed to be here and valued her all the more for it. When they finally broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I should go. Let you rest after yesterday. But I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll ride the boundary together, check the storm damage. I'll be ready. He left reluctantly, and Eleanor spent the rest of the day in a daze of happiness and disbelief, alternating between working on small ranch tasks and simply standing on the porch, staring at the northern horizon where his ranch lay beyond the ridge. The next weeks unfolded with a sweetness Eleanor had never expected to find in her hard new life. Caleb came by every day, sometimes to work, sometimes just to share a meal or sit on the porch in the evening, watching the sunset paint the sky impossible colors. They talked for hours, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for their futures, the thousand small details that built intimacy between two people. Eleanor learned that Caleb loved reading but was self-conscious about his limited education, that he had a gift for working with difficult horses, that he sang quietly to the cattle when he thought no one could hear. Caleb learned that Eleanor had a wicked sense of humor hidden beneath her serious determination, that she missed the ocean even though she'd rarely seen it, that she dreamed of one day building a larger house with a real library. You could do that, Caleb said one evening as they sat on her porch watching stars emerge. Build whatever you want on this land. You've got the resources and the will. It seems frivolous when there's so much practical work to do. Dreams aren't frivolous. They're what keep you working through the hard times. Caleb was quiet for a moment. My dream is to build something lasting, a ranch that can support a family, that'll still be here in 50 years with my name on it. Something that can't be taken away by drought or debt or bad luck. Eleanor heard the echo of his father's suicide in those words, the determination to succeed where his family had failed. You'll do it, she said with certainty. You're too stubborn to fail. We could do it together, Caleb said softly. If things work out how I hope they will, combine our properties, build something bigger and stronger than either ranch alone. The possibility hung between them, tantalizing and terrifying. Eleanor imagined it. Two ranches merged, two lives joined, the kind of partnership that could weather any storm because it was built on mutual respect and shared strength. 3 months? She reminded him, though her heart was already decided. We agreed to wait. I know, but that doesn't stop me thinking about it. Caleb stood, offering his hand to help her up. Walk with me. They strolled through the evening shadows, not touching but close enough that Eleanor felt the pull between them like a physical force. The ranch was peaceful around them. Cattle settled for the night, the creek murmuring in the distance, the wind carrying the smell of sage and summer grass. I never thought I'd find this, Eleanor said quietly. When I got on that train in Boston, I was running from a slow death, but I wasn't running toward anything specific, just away. And now I have a home, work that matters, and someone who makes me feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Caleb stopped walking, turning to face her. You make me feel the same way. Like all the years of being alone were just preparation for finding you. He kissed her under the emerging stars, gentle and reverent, and Eleanor felt the last of her resistance to this happiness crumble away. 3 months seemed like an eternity to wait, but she understood why Caleb insisted on it. They needed to be sure. Needed to see each other through work and struggle and the mundane dailiness of life, not just the dramatic moments. But in her heart, Eleanor was already certain. This quiet, capable man who'd taught her to survive had also taught her to hope, and that was a gift beyond price. August brought brutal heat and the hard work of preparing for fall roundup. Caleb and Eleanor worked their ranches separately during the days, but came together in the evenings to plan and strategize. They'd need help for roundup. The work was too much for 2 people alone, so Caleb rode to neighboring ranches to arrange for hands willing to work for wages and a share of the profits. Tom Brennan's sending 2 of his sons, Caleb reported one evening, and I've got 3 drifters who worked for me last year. Good men, if a bit rough around the edges. That should be enough for both our ranches. Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness. She'd grown comfortable working with Caleb, but the thought of strange men on her property, judging her competence, made her anxious. Will they take orders from a woman? They'll take orders from a ranch owner who knows her business, Caleb said firmly. You're not some city girl playing at ranching anymore, Eleanor. You've earned your place here. Any man who doesn't respect that can find work elsewhere. His confidence in her steadied Eleanor's nerves. He was right. She'd changed. 3 months of brutal work had transformed her from a terrified seamstress into someone capable and strong. She could check cattle, mend fence, handle a horse, shoot a rifle, manage the 1,000 daily tasks that kept a ranch running. She'd earned the right to run her own property. The hired hands arrived in early September, weather-beaten men who viewed Eleanor with open skepticism until they saw her work. She roped alongside them, rode hard through long days separating cattle, worked the branding fire without flinching from the heat or the smell. By the end of the first week, their skepticism had turned to grudging respect. Tom Brennan's sons, Jake and Samuel, were younger than Eleanor and both clearly fascinated by this woman rancher their father had told them about. They competed for her attention in ways that might have been flattering if Eleanor hadn't been so focused on the work, and if her heart hadn't already belonged to Caleb. Caleb noticed, of course. Eleanor saw the tension in his jaw when Jake offered to help her saddle her horse, the way his hands clenched when Samuel brought her coffee and lingered too long making conversation. One evening after the hands had gone to their camp, Caleb confronted it directly. "Those boys are sniffing around you like hounds on a scent." Eleanor looked up from the tally sheet she was reviewing. "They're being friendly. They're being interested. There's a difference." "Are you jealous?" Eleanor asked, surprised and oddly pleased. "Yes." Caleb's honesty was blunt as always. "I don't like other men looking at you like you're available when you're not. I haven't told them I'm not available. We agreed to keep this private until we were certain. I'm certain now." Caleb crossed the distance between them, pulling Eleanor up from her chair. "I was certain weeks ago. Watching you work Roundup, seeing you hold your own with the men, the way you handled that difficult calf birth yesterday. Every day just proves what I already knew. You're exactly who I want building a life with." Eleanor's breath caught. "It hasn't been 3 months yet." "Close enough, and I'm done pretending I can wait patiently." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "Marry me, Eleanor. Combine our ranches, our lives, our futures. Let's build something together that'll last long after we're gone." Eleanor's heart soared even as her practical mind raised questions. "We barely know each other. 3 months isn't long." "I know you better than I've known anyone. I know you're strong and stubborn and brave as hell. I know you don't quit even when you're terrified. I know you care about doing things right more than doing things easy. What else do I need to know? That I snore sometimes, that I'm terrible at cooking anything more complicated than coffee and eggs, that I have nightmares about being back in Boston, trapped in that boarding house." Eleanor's voice shook. "That I'm afraid I'm not good enough for this, for you, for any of it." Caleb's expression softened. "I already know all of that. I hear you moving around at night when the dreams wake you. I've eaten your cooking and survived it, and I've watched you prove every day that you're more than good enough for this life." He cupped her face in his calloused hands. "Say yes, Eleanor. Take this leap with me." Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw her future there. Work and struggle, yes, but also partnership and love, and the kind of belonging she'd never found anywhere else. This hard country had tested her and found her worthy. This hard man had seen past her city's softness to the strength beneath. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Caleb kissed her with a passion that made her dizzy, then laughed and spun her around in a circle that had them both stumbling. "We'll do it soon," he said, "before winter. I don't want to spend another season alone when I could be spending it with you." They told the ranch hands the next morning, and if the men were surprised, they hid it well. Jake and Samuel looked disappointed, but wished them well. The older hands just nodded like they'd seen it coming all along. The news spread through the small ranching community with remarkable speed. Within a week, Eleanor received visits from neighboring ranch wives she'd never met, women who brought gifts of preserves and advice, and barely concealed curiosity about the city woman who'd managed to capture Caleb Turner's heart. Martha Brennan, wife of Tom and the same woman who'd given Eleanor that first ranching guide on the train, arrived with a knowing smile. "I told you to find someone to teach you. Didn't expect you to marry your teacher, but I can't say I'm surprised. Caleb's a good man. You chose well." "He chose me," Eleanor corrected. "You chose each other. That's how the good marriages work." Martha settled in at the kitchen table like she planned to stay a while. Now, let's talk practical matters. You'll want a proper wedding, I assume, but nothing fancy. This is ranch country, not Boston society. They planned it together over the next weeks. A simple ceremony in Bent Creek's small church, a celebration dinner at the town's only boarding house that could accommodate a crowd. Eleanor would wear a dress she'd make herself, something practical enough to wear again instead of an elaborate gown that would hang unused in a closet. Caleb would wear his best suit, the one he'd brought from Missouri, and probably hadn't touched since arriving in Colorado. Eleanor threw herself into the preparations with the same fierce determination she'd brought to learning ranch work. She sewed her wedding dress by lamplight, cream-colored calico with simple lines that flattered her newly strong frame. She ordered supplies from the general store for the celebration meal, planned the menu with Martha's help, wrote brief letters to the few people from her past who might care that she was marrying, the boarding house owner in Boston, a former colleague from the sewing shop. But as the wedding date approached, Eleanor felt an unexpected hollowness. She had no family to invite, no mother to help her dress, no father to walk her down the aisle, no siblings to stand up with her. Theodore was gone, and he'd been the only blood relative she'd had left. Caleb found her crying on the porch one evening, 3 weeks before the wedding. "What's wrong?" He sat beside her, pulling her against his chest. "I'm being foolish." Eleanor wiped at her eyes. "But I just realized I'll be walking down that aisle completely alone. No one to give me away, no family to witness it. It made me feel very small and lost." "You're not alone," Caleb's voice was firm. "You've got Martha and Tom Brennan, the whole community that's welcomed you. You've got me and everything we're building together." "I know, but it's not the same as having a mother or a sister or anyone who shares my blood." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "My family's gone too. Parents dead, siblings scattered. I understand that particular kind of lonely. But family isn't just blood, Eleanor. It's the people who show up when you need them, who celebrate your happiness and mourn your sorrows. By that measure, you've got more family here than you ever did in Boston." He was right, Eleanor realized. The seamstress shop girls she'd worked with had been friendly but distant. The boarding house had been full of people who shared walls but not lives. Here in this hard country, neighbors rode through storms to help, brought food when you were overwhelmed, taught you skills that kept you alive. That was family in the way that mattered. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly, "for understanding, for not making me feel silly about it." "Your feelings are never silly." Caleb kissed the top of her head. "And for what it's worth, you won't walk down that aisle completely alone. I talked to Martha, and she's offered to stand with you as a mother of the bride would. Tom will walk you down if you want, or you can walk yourself. It's your choice." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. "You arranged that?" "I know what it's like to feel unmoored. Figured you didn't need to feel that way on your wedding day." She turned in his arms and kissed him deeply, pouring into it all the gratitude and love she couldn't quite put into words. This man understood her in ways she'd never expected, saw her needs before she spoke them, cared about her happiness as much as his own. "I love you," Eleanor said when they broke apart. It was the first time either of them had spoken the words directly, and they hung in the air between them, precious and powerful. "I love you too." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. "More than I thought I could love anyone after so much loss. You make me believe in futures again, instead of just surviving day to day." They sat together as darkness fell, wrapped in each other in the knowledge that soon they'd be bound by vows and law and choice, building one life from two separate struggles. The wedding took place on a brilliant October morning when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the first hints of coming winter. Eleanor dressed in Martha's spare room at the boarding house, her hands steady as she buttoned her wedding dress and pinned her hair. "You look beautiful," Martha said, adjusting the simple wildflower crown they'd made that morning. "Like you belong here, like you were born to this life." Eleanor studied herself in the small mirror. She did look different from the pale, frightened woman who'd arrived in Bent Creek 5 months ago. Her face was sun-touched and healthy, her body strong, her eyes clear and certain. She looked like a woman who knew her own mind and wasn't afraid of hard choices. The church was small and plain, filled with ranchers and their families who'd come to witness this unlikely union. Eleanor walked down the aisle on Tom Brennan's arm, grateful for his steady presence. but her eyes were only for Caleb waiting at the altar. He looked different in his suit, almost formal, but his eyes held the same warmth and certainty they always did when he looked at her. When Tom placed her hand in Caleb's, Eleanor felt the rightness of it down to her bones. The ceremony was brief and simple. They spoke their vows clearly, promising to honor and cherish, to build a life together through whatever hardships came. When the preacher pronounced them married and Caleb kissed her, Eleanor felt a profound sense of coming home, not to a place, but to a person. The celebration afterward was rowdy and joyful, the boarding house packed with well-wishers who toasted the couple and shared stories and danced to fiddle music played by old cowboys who surprised everyone with their skill. Eleanor danced with Caleb, with Tom Brennan, with several of the ranch hands who'd worked Roundup. She laughed more than she had in years, felt lighter than she'd known was possible. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift away, Caleb leaned close and whispered, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Turner?" Mrs. Turner. Eleanor tested the name in her mind and found it fit perfectly. Yes, let's go home. They rode back to Eleanor's ranch, their ranch now, though they hadn't yet decided which property would become the main homestead. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead, their breath frosting in the air. They rode close together, sometimes their legs brushing, connected even in the simple act of traveling. Inside the house, Caleb built up the fire, while Eleanor changed out of her wedding dress. When she emerged in her simple nightgown and robe, he was waiting with 2 cups of coffee, a quiet smile on his face. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find this was all a dream," Eleanor said, accepting the coffee. "That I'm still in that Boston boarding house, still sewing until my fingers bleed, still trapped in a life that was slowly killing me. It's real." Caleb set down his cup and pulled her close. "You're here. We're married. This is our life now, whatever we make of it." He kissed her then, different from all the kisses before, deeper, more urgent, carrying the promise of their wedding vows. Eleanor responded with equal passion, letting herself feel the full force of her desire for this man who'd become her partner in every sense. They made love with a tenderness that surprised Eleanor, given their usual practical directness with each other. But here, in this most intimate connection, Caleb was patient and gentle, learning her body with the same careful attention he'd brought to teaching her ranch work. Eleanor let herself be vulnerable in ways she'd never allowed before, trusting him with parts of herself she'd kept guarded. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, the fire crackling and Eleanor's head resting on Caleb's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. "We'll combine the ranches," Caleb said quietly, "run them as one operation. We can use this house as a line shack during busy seasons and build something bigger on my property. There's a better spot for a main house near water and sheltered from the worst winds." "A house with a library?" Eleanor asked, remembering her dream. "A house with whatever you want. We'll build it together, exactly how we need it." Eleanor closed her eyes, imagining it. A real home, built to last, filled with the life they'd create together. Children, maybe, if they were blessed. Years of work and struggle and joy, 2 people facing the frontier as partners. "I'm happy," she said, surprised by the simple truth of it. "I didn't think I'd ever get to say that and mean it completely." "Neither did I." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "But here we are, 2 lost people who found each other in the middle of nowhere and somehow made it into something beautiful." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other, and in the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. The frontier was still hard, winter was still coming, and there would be struggles and setbacks and moments of doubt. But they'd chosen each other, and that choice made everything else possible. Eleanor's last thought before sleep claimed her was how far she'd come from that terrified woman on the westbound train. She'd found not just survival in this hard country, but transformation. She'd become someone strong enough to claim a life worth living, and she'd found a partner worthy of sharing it with. Tomorrow they'd begin their real work as a married couple, combining their efforts and resources, building the future they'd only dreamed about separately. But tonight was for rest and gratitude and the quiet joy of knowing that the loneliness was finally over. They'd found each other. They'd found home. And that was more than either had dared hope for when they'd first met in that dusty ranch yard. 2 strangers who didn't yet know they were each other's answer to prayers They'd been too tired to speak aloud. The work of combining two ranches into one operation began the morning after the wedding. Eleanor and Caleb rose before dawn, the October chill biting through the bedroom walls, and started the day as they would every day forward. Together, partners in labor, as much as in love. "We'll need to move the bulk of your herd to my northern pasture," Caleb said over breakfast, spreading a rough map he'd drawn across the table. "Better grass there, and the water source is more reliable through winter. Your southern section we can use for the horses and the breeding stock. It's more sheltered when the blizzards come." Eleanor studied the map, her mind already calculating the work involved. "That's nearly 400 head to move. How long will it take?" 3 days if the weather holds and we push hard. I've got Jake and Samuel Brennan coming to help, and Tom said he'd send over 2 more hands if we need them." Caleb traced a line across the paper. "We'll drive them up through the valley route, keep them away from the rough terrain where we might lose stragglers." They spent the morning organizing supplies and checking equipment, working with the seamless coordination they'd developed over months of labor. Eleanor no longer needed Caleb to explain every task. She understood the rhythm of ranch work now, could anticipate what needed doing, and move to accomplish it without being told. The cattle drive began 2 days later under clear skies that Caleb eyed with suspicion. "Too clear," he muttered. "Weather's going to turn. We need to move fast." He was right. They pushed the herd hard, Eleanor riding point with Caleb while the Brennan boys worked the flanks and the hired hands brought up the rear. The cattle moved reluctantly at first, balking at leaving familiar pasture, but eventually settled into a steady plodding progress northward. Eleanor had ridden plenty since arriving in Colorado, but never anything like this, hours in the saddle without rest, eating dust and breathing the constant low of cattle, her body aching but her mind sharp and focused. Sally, her mare, responded to the smallest signals now, cutting and weaving through the herd like she could read Eleanor's thoughts. "You've become quite the rider," Jake Brennan called out during a brief rest, genuine admiration in his voice. Any romantic interest he'd held had faded into respectful friendship after the wedding. "Pa says you could hire out as a drover if ranching doesn't work out." Eleanor laughed, wiping dust from her face. "I think I'll stick with my own land, thanks. I've done enough wandering for one lifetime." By the second day, Caleb's weather prediction proved accurate. The wind shifted, coming down cold from the north, and clouds began building on the horizon. They pushed the cattle harder, trying to reach the northern pasture before the storm hit, but nature moved faster than even the most determined cowboys. The snow started as light flurries that evening, just as they were settling the herd into their new grazing land. Within an hour, it had become a full blizzard, wind-driven snow that reduced visibility to almost nothing. "Everyone to the line shack!" Caleb shouted over the wind's roar. "Cattle know enough to hunker down. We can't help them if we freeze to death trying." The line shack was a crude shelter on Caleb's property, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had a stove and bunks and protection from the killing wind. They crowded inside. Eleanor and Caleb, the Brennan boys, 3 hired hands, and built up the fire while the storm raged outside. "This is early for a blizzard," Tom Brennan's oldest son Samuel said, huddled near the stove. "Usually don't see this kind of snow until November." "Frontier doesn't care about usual," one of the older hands said. He was a grizzled man named Pete who'd worked these ranges for decades. "I've seen snow in September and no snow until January. You just deal with what comes." They were trapped for 2 days while the storm exhausted itself. Eleanor found herself playing cook, stretching their limited supplies to feed 7 hungry people while the snow piled higher outside. It reminded her of the boarding house in some ways, the close quarters, the need to make do with little. But the feeling was entirely different. These people weren't strangers tolerating each other's presence. They were a team, bound together by shared purpose and mutual reliance. Caleb caught her eye across the cramped space and smiled, a private expression that warmed her more than the fire. This was their life now, hard work and harder weather, but faced together with people they could trust. When the storm finally broke, they emerged to a transformed world. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the pasture, the sky an impossible blue, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. They found the cattle bunched in a sheltered draw, most alive but some dead from the cold or smothered in drifts. 15 head lost, Caleb reported after they'd counted. Could have been worse. Much worse. They spent the next week digging out, checking the surviving cattle for frostbite and injury, and securing the ranches against future storms. Eleanor worked until her hands were raw despite her gloves, until exhaustion made her stumble. But she never complained. This was the reality of frontier life, beauty and brutality in equal measure, survival earned through constant vigilance and backbreaking labor. As November settled in with bitter cold but no more major storms, Eleanor and Caleb began the work of truly merging their operations. They combined their finances, pooling Eleanor's inheritance money with Caleb's savings, to create a fund for expanding the herd and improving infrastructure. They drew up plans for the new house they'd build come spring, sketching designs by lamplight and arguing cheerfully over details. "The kitchen needs to be larger," Eleanor insisted. "If we're going to have hired hands for roundup and branding, I need space to cook for them properly." "Fine, bigger kitchen, but I want a real workshop attached to the barn, somewhere I can repair equipment in winter without freezing." They compromised and adjusted, learning the give and take of partnership in both work and domestic life. Eleanor discovered that Caleb was meticulous about record-keeping but terrible at mending his own clothes. Caleb learned that Eleanor had a fierce temper when pushed too far but cooled quickly if given space to compose herself. Martha Brennan visited regularly through the fall, ostensibly to check on Eleanor, but really, Eleanor suspected, to make sure the newlyweds were managing their transition well. She brought practical gifts, preserves, winter vegetables from her root cellar, advice about surviving the long, isolated months ahead. "The hardest part isn't the cold or the work," Martha said one afternoon as she and Eleanor sorted through supplies. "It's the loneliness. Even with a good husband, the winters can feel very long when you're snowed in for weeks at a time." "I have books," Eleanor said, "and I'm thinking of learning to knit properly. I can sew, but I've never mastered knitting." "I'll teach you." Martha pulled out needles and yarn from her bag. "And I'll tell you what my mother told me when I married Tom and came west. Find ways to keep your mind active. Read, write letters, even if you can't mail them until spring. Keep a journal. The women who go mad out here are the ones who let the silence consume them." Eleanor took the advice seriously. She started a journal that first winter, recording the daily details of ranch life, but also her thoughts and feelings about this strange new existence. She wrote about the satisfaction of watching cattle she'd helped birth grow strong and healthy. She wrote about the terror of storms and the beauty of fresh snow sparkling under moonlight. She wrote about falling more deeply in love with Caleb as the weeks passed, learning his rhythms and moods, and the unexpected gentleness beneath his practical exterior. December brought the hardest cold Eleanor had yet experienced. The thermometer outside the kitchen window dropped below zero and stayed there for days. The cattle huddled together for warmth, breath freezing in clouds around them. Eleanor and Caleb bundled in every layer they owned and went out twice daily to break ice on the water troughs and check for animals in distress. "This is what kills people," Caleb said one brutal morning as they worked. "Not the dramatic storms, but this grinding cold that just doesn't stop. You get tired, stop being careful, make a mistake. Suddenly you're lost or injured and the cold finishes you." "Then we won't make mistakes," Eleanor said through the scarf wrapped around her face. "We'll be careful and watch out for each other." But even with caution, accidents happened. Eleanor slipped on ice while carrying water to the horses and fell hard, her wrist catching her weight at a bad angle. Pain shot through her arm so sharp it made her vision gray. Caleb was beside her instantly, gently probing the injury. "Sprained, not broken, I think, but you can't use this hand for at least a week." "I can't not use it. There's too much work." "Then I'll do your share along with mine." Caleb's voice was firm. "That's what partners do. You'd do the same if I was hurt." He was right, and Eleanor let him help her inside, let him wrap her wrist and make her rest while he handled the evening chores alone. It went against every instinct she'd developed, the need to prove herself capable, to never be a burden. But she was learning that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. The injury forced Eleanor to slow down, to spend days inside managing household tasks one-handed while Caleb worked outside. She used the time to plan menus for the coming months, to sort and organize their combined possessions, to think about the future they were building. One evening, as Caleb came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots, Eleanor worked up the courage to raise something that had been on her mind for weeks. "I've been thinking about children," she said, the words tumbling out quickly before she lost her nerve. "Whether we want them, when might be the right time?" Caleb paused in the act of hanging up his coat, then crossed to where Eleanor sat by the fire. "I want children," he said quietly. "Want to build something that outlasts us, a legacy beyond just the ranch. But I'm also scared, if I'm being honest." "Scared of what?" "Of losing you to childbirth. Of not being a good father because I lost my own so young. Of bringing children into a world this hard and watching them suffer." Caleb knelt beside her chair, taking her good hand in both of his. "But I'm more scared of letting fear stop us from living fully. So yes, I want children. With you. When you're ready." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm ready. Or at least, I'm willing to be scared and try anyway." Caleb kissed her gently. "Then we'll try. And we'll figure it out together, like everything else." They made love that night with new intentionality, not just expressing desire, but consciously choosing to create a future that included new lives. Eleanor felt the weight of it, the awesome responsibility, but also a fierce joy. She'd come to this land with nothing, built a life from scratch through determination and help from a good man. Now she would help create entirely new people who would carry forward what they'd started. January passed in a blur of cold and work, and the growing intimacy that came from surviving hardship side by side. February brought a brief thaw that turned the snow to slush and made travel possible again. Caleb rode to Bent Creek for supplies and returned with news that made Eleanor's heart sink. "There's a railroad company buying up land south of here," he said, unpacking the supplies in the kitchen. "They're planning to run tracks through sometime in the next 2 years. It'll change everything, bring more people, more commerce, but also more competition for grazing land and water rights." "Is that good or bad for us?" Eleanor asked. "Depends on how we handle it. Could mean better prices for our cattle if we can ship them east more easily. Could also mean losing land if the railroad decides to run through our property." Caleb sat heavily at the table. "We'll need to be strategic. Maybe hire a lawyer to protect our interests." It was a reminder that even in this isolated country, the world kept changing. The frontier that had seemed so vast and untamed was being measured, mapped, and divided up by forces beyond any individual rancher's control. They'd have to adapt or be crushed by progress. "We'll handle it," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "We've handled everything else." March arrived with the first hints of coming spring, days where the temperature climbed above freezing, nights that were merely cold instead of deadly. The cattle grew restless, ready for new grass and open range. Eleanor and Caleb began planning for calving season, for the work of branding and castrating and all the brutal necessary tasks that ensured the herd's health. But before any of that could begin, Eleanor woke one morning feeling queasy and strange. She barely made it outside before vomiting into the snow, her body heaving even though she'd eaten nothing that could have been spoiled. Caleb found her there, pale and shaking. "Are you sick? Did you eat something bad?" Eleanor looked at him and felt certainty settle over her like a blanket. "I think I'm pregnant." The words hung in the cold air between them. Caleb's face went through a dozen expressions in as many seconds: shock, fear, wonder, and finally pure joy. He pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding her like she was something infinitely precious and fragile. "Are you sure?" "Not completely, but yes. I think so." Eleanor's voice shook. "I'm scared, Caleb. I don't know anything about being a mother, about childbirth. I could die." "The baby could die. Shh." Caleb stroked her back. "We'll get through it. We'll get Martha to help, find the best doctor in Denver if we need to. You're strong, Eleanor. Stronger than anyone I know. If anyone can do this, you can." They told Martha 2 weeks later when Eleanor's condition became undeniable. The older woman examined Eleanor with practiced efficiency and confirmed what they'd suspected. "You're healthy and young. Good odds for a safe delivery," Martha said. "Baby should come in late September, early October if my calculations are right. That gives us time to prepare." Eleanor spent the spring learning yet another set of skills: how to prepare for childbirth, what supplies she'd need, what signs meant trouble. Martha visited weekly, bringing wisdom earned through her own 4 pregnancies and deliveries. Eleanor read medical books Caleb brought from town and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. But mostly, as the months passed and her body changed, Eleanor focused on the work at hand. She helped with calving season, despite Caleb's protests, though she let him handle the heavier lifting. She rode fence lines, checking for winter damage, planted a garden with Martha's help, and began sewing tiny clothes in the evenings while Caleb worked on ledgers. The railroad issue came to a head in May, when surveyors appeared on the southern edge of their property. Caleb rode out to meet them, Eleanor at his side despite his concerns about her riding and her condition. "This is private property," Caleb said, his voice hard. "You can't just come through without permission." The head surveyor, a thin man with spectacles and a superior air, barely glanced at them. "We have authorization from the territorial government. The railroad route was approved last year. You should have received notice." "We received nothing." Eleanor guided her horse forward, matching Caleb's authoritative tone. "And territorial approval doesn't override private property rights. We'll need to see documentation and discuss compensation before any tracks cross our land." The surveyor finally looked at her properly, taking in her obvious pregnancy and working clothes with poorly concealed disdain. "Ma'am, perhaps your husband should handle the business matters. My wife is co-owner of this ranch, and every bit as qualified to discuss legal matters as I am," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You'll deal with both of us or neither of us." The surveyor's expression soured, but he pulled papers from his saddlebag. "The proposed route runs through your southern pasture. The railroad is prepared to offer compensation at standard rates, $5 per acre for right-of-way." Eleanor calculated quickly in her head. The southern pasture was roughly 100 acres. $500 was nothing compared to the grazing land they'd lose, the disruption to their operation, the access it would give to anyone traveling the railroad. "Not acceptable," she said firmly. "That land is worth far more to us than $5 an acre. We'll need at least 20 per acre, plus guarantees about fence maintenance and liability for any cattle killed by trains." The surveyor sputtered. "That's highway robbery. The railroad will never agree to such terms." "Then the railroad can find another route." Caleb's tone left no room for negotiation. "We're not desperate people who can be bullied into a bad deal. Come back with a reasonable offer, or don't come back at all." They rode away, leaving the surveyor furious behind them. Once out of earshot, Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "Did I overstep? Demanding 20 per acre?" "You were perfect," Caleb grinned at her. "Tough as nails and twice as sharp." That man never expected to negotiate with someone who knew the land's real value. The railroad company did come back 2 weeks later with a revised offer. $15 per acre, fence maintenance guarantees, and liability coverage. It still wasn't ideal, but it was fair enough that Caleb and Eleanor accepted after consulting with the lawyer Caleb had hired to protect their interests. "This is the future," the lawyer, a sharp young man named Morrison, told them in his Bent Creek office. "More railroads, more settlement, more people pushing into ranching country. The ones who survive will be those who adapt without losing what makes their operations viable." Eleanor thought about that often, as summer progressed and her pregnancy advanced. The world was changing, bringing both opportunities and threats. Their child would grow up in a very different Colorado than the one she'd arrived in. More civilized, perhaps, but also more complicated. By August, Eleanor was heavy and uncomfortable, her body swollen and aching in ways that made even simple tasks difficult. Caleb hovered anxiously, trying to keep her from working too hard, but Eleanor refused to become completely useless. "Women have been having babies since the dawn of time," she reminded him when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "I'm pregnant, not dying." "You could be doing both if you're not careful." The words were harsh, but the fear beneath them was real. Caleb had lost too many people he loved. The thought of losing Eleanor terrified him in ways he couldn't always articulate. Eleanor softened, taking his hand and placing it on her swollen belly where the baby kicked and moved. "Feel that? That's life, Caleb. Strong life. This baby is fighting to be born, and I'm fighting to bring it safely into the world. Have some faith in us." The labor began on a September evening, 3 weeks before Eleanor had expected it. She was helping Caleb prepare dinner when the first contraction hit, sharp and unmistakable. She gripped the table edge, breathing through it, and watched Caleb's face go white. "I'm riding for Martha," he said, already moving toward the door. "There's time," Eleanor managed. "First babies take hours usually, but yes, get Martha, and stay calm." He was gone in minutes, riding hard for the Brennan Ranch. Eleanor used the time to prepare, gathering the supplies Martha had helped her assemble, changing into a nightgown, trying to remember all the advice she'd been given about breathing and positions and what to expect. Martha arrived within the hour, calm and efficient, taking charge with the kind of authority that came from experience. She examined Eleanor, asked questions about the timing and intensity of contractions, and nodded with satisfaction. "You've got several hours yet. First babies like to take their time." She turned to Caleb, who looked like he might be sick. "Boil water, tear those clean sheets into strips like I showed you, and try not to faint. Your wife needs you steady." The hours that followed blurred together in Eleanor's memory afterward, pain and effort and Martha's steady voice guiding her through each contraction. Caleb stayed by her side, letting her grip his hand until she thought she might break his fingers, wiping sweat from her face, murmuring encouragement even though his own fear was palpable. "I can't do this," Eleanor gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. "It's too much. I can't." "You can and you are," Martha said firmly. "You're the strongest woman I know, Eleanor Turner. You learned to run a ranch from nothing in 6 months. You can birth this baby." And somehow, in the darkest hours before dawn, Eleanor did. She pushed until she thought she might tear apart, screamed until her throat was raw, and finally heard the most beautiful sound she'd ever experienced, her baby's first cry, angry and strong and utterly alive. "A girl," Martha announced, placing the tiny squalling bundle on Eleanor's chest. "Healthy and loud. Congratulations." Eleanor looked down at her daughter, this impossible, perfect creature she'd created, and felt something shift permanently in her heart. The baby was red and wrinkled and covered in birth fluids, but she was beautiful beyond words. She was a future made flesh, a promise kept. Caleb leaned over them both, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "She's perfect. You're perfect. You did it, Eleanor. You brought our daughter into the world." "We did it," Eleanor corrected, her voice hoarse. "All of us together." They named her Rose after Caleb's mother and spent the days after her birth in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. Eleanor learned to nurse, to change diapers, to interpret the different cries and needs. Caleb proved surprisingly adept with the baby, patient in ways Eleanor hadn't fully appreciated before, walking Rose around the house at night when she fussed, singing to her in his rough voice. Martha stayed for a week, teaching Eleanor the basics of infant care and making sure there were no complications from the birth. Other ranch wives visited, bringing food and supplies and advice. The community that had welcomed Eleanor when she arrived alone now celebrated her daughter's arrival, this new life in hard country. By October, Eleanor had recovered enough to resume light work. She strapped Rose to her chest in a sling Martha had made and went about her daily tasks, the baby sleeping against her heartbeat. It wasn't efficient, but it worked. They were adapting, as they always did. The first anniversary of Eleanor's arrival in Colorado came and went without fanfare. There was too much work to do, marking artificial milestones. But one evening, as Eleanor nursed Rose by the fire while Caleb worked on his ledgers, she thought about how completely her life had transformed in 12 short months. She'd come to Colorado a desperate seamstress with no prospects and no hope. She'd found a ranch, a partner, a purpose, and now a child. She'd become someone she barely recognized, strong and capable and unafraid to face whatever came. The frontier had tested her and found her worthy, and she had found, against all odds, that she belonged here in this hard, beautiful country, building a life that mattered alongside a man who understood that true partnership meant sharing both the burden and the triumph. Rose finished nursing, and Eleanor shifted her to her shoulder, patting gently until a satisfying burp emerged. Caleb looked up from his work and smiled, that soft expression he reserved for his wife and daughter. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we've come, how much has changed, and how much is still to come." Caleb set aside his ledger and came to sit beside them. "The railroad will bring more change, more people settling, more competition. We'll need to be smart and flexible." "We will be." Eleanor leaned against him, Rose drowsing between them. We've proven we can handle anything if we face it together. It was true. Whatever came next, whether prosperity or hardship, growth or struggle, they would meet it as they'd met everything else, as partners, as equals, as two people who'd found each other in an unlikely place and built something lasting from courage and commitment and love. The fire crackled, the baby slept, and the Colorado wind sang its endless song outside their walls. And Eleanor knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The years that followed Rose's birth unfolded with the rhythm of seasons. Brutal winters giving way to hopeful springs, scorching summers yielding to golden autumns. The ranch thrived under Eleanor and Caleb's joint management, expanding gradually as they purchased adjacent parcels from settlers who couldn't hack the frontier life. Their herd grew to nearly 600 head, and the new house Caleb had promised finally rose from the foundation they'd laid the spring after Rose's first birthday. Eleanor stood in the doorway of that house on a crisp October morning in 1883, 5 years after she'd first arrived in Colorado, and marveled at how solid it felt. 2 stories of sturdy timber, windows that actually fit their frames, a kitchen twice the size of her original ranch house, and yes, a small room lined with shelves that served as their library. It wasn't grand by Eastern standards, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and money, designed for their specific needs. Rose, now 4 years old with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin, played on the porch with a collection of wooden animals Caleb had carved during the previous winter's long evenings. She was joined by her younger brother, James, barely 2 and tottering after his sister with the single-minded focus of a child who desperately wanted to keep up. "Mama, when is the lady coming?" Rose asked, looking up from her play. "Soon, sweetheart, before supper," Martha said. The lady in question was someone Eleanor had been thinking about for months, a young woman named Sarah Chen who'd written to Martha Brennan seeking information about opportunities in Colorado. Sarah's story had resonated deeply with Eleanor. She was the daughter of Chinese immigrants who'd come to build the railroad, orphaned when her parents died of fever, left with no family and few prospects in San Francisco's Chinatown. She'd heard that some frontier ranches needed help and was willing to work hard for room, board, and the chance at a different life. Martha had brought the letter to Eleanor. "She reminds me of someone," Martha had said with a knowing smile. "A certain seamstress from Boston who arrived here with nothing but determination and a carpetbag." Eleanor had written back immediately, offering Sarah a position helping with the household and the children. It wasn't charity. With the ranch expanding and 2 small children to manage, Eleanor genuinely needed help. But it was also something more. It was Eleanor remembering what it felt like to be alone and terrified, and offering the same lifeline that had once been offered to her. Caleb emerged from the barn leading his horse, already saddled for the ride to Bent Creek to collect their guest. The town had grown considerably since Eleanor's arrival. The railroad had brought commerce and people, transforming the dusty outpost into something approaching a real community. There was a proper school now, a doctor's office, even a small hotel for travelers. "I should be back before dark," Caleb said, mounting up. He looked at Eleanor with that soft expression she'd come to treasure. "You're sure about this? Taking in a stranger?" "I was a stranger once. Someone took a chance on me. That was different. I knew your uncle." "Barely." Eleanor walked over to him, her hand resting on his leg. "We're established now, Caleb. We can afford to help someone who needs it, and maybe she'll be exactly what we need too." He leaned down to kiss her, a brief touch that still sent warmth through Eleanor's chest, even after 5 years of marriage. "You have the biggest heart of anyone I know. It's one of the things I love most about you." Eleanor watched him ride toward town, then turned back to the organized chaos of her household. There was bread to finish baking, the spare bedroom to prepare, children to feed and supervise, and 100 other small tasks that filled her days. It was so different from her old life that sometimes Eleanor could barely remember the pale, frightened woman she'd been. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of copper and gold, Caleb returned with their guest. Sarah Chen was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with glossy black hair pulled into a neat braid and eyes that took in everything with cautious intelligence. She wore simple dark clothing that had seen better days, and she clutched a small bundle that appeared to contain all her worldly possessions. Eleanor saw herself in that bundle, in the way Sarah held her shoulders rigid with determination despite obvious fear. "Miss Chen, welcome to our home," Eleanor said warmly, descending the porch steps. "I'm Eleanor Turner, and these are my children, Rose and James." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Eleanor suspected at seeing a woman rancher, or perhaps at the warmth of the greeting. "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Turner. I will work very hard. I promise not to disappoint you." "I'm sure you won't. Come inside. You must be exhausted from the journey." Over supper that night, Sarah's story emerged in halting pieces. Her parents had died 3 years ago. She'd been working in a San Francisco laundry, barely surviving on starvation wages, sleeping in a crowded boarding house where she was never safe and never rested. When she'd heard about opportunities in Colorado, she'd spent every penny she had on a train ticket west, gambling everything on the hope of something better. "I can cook, clean, sew, and take care of children," Sarah said earnestly. "I learn quickly, and I am not afraid of hard work." "Those are valuable skills," Eleanor said. "But out here, you'll need to learn others too. Ranch work, animal care, how to handle the isolation, and the weather. It's a hard life, Sarah. I won't lie to you about that." "Harder than the laundry?" Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "Harder than being hungry and scared every day?" "I do not think so." Eleanor and Caleb exchanged glances. They both recognized that particular combination of desperation and determination. "Then you'll fit right in," Caleb said. "Eleanor will teach you what you need to know. Just promise you'll ask questions when you're uncertain. Ignorance isn't shameful out here, but refusing to learn will get you killed." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I understand. I will ask." The first weeks tested Sarah in ways that clearly surprised her. She'd expected domestic work, but Eleanor insisted she learn all aspects of ranch life just as Eleanor had. Sarah learned to ride, though she was terrified of horses at first. She learned to check cattle, to recognize signs of illness, to mend fence, and manage the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running. Eleanor taught her with the same patience Caleb had shown her 5 years earlier, remembering what it felt like to be overwhelmed and ignorant. And slowly, Sarah transformed. Her shoulders straightened, her hands grew calloused. Her initial fearfulness gave way to quiet confidence. The children adored her. Sarah had a gift with young ones, playing endless patient games with Rose and James, telling them stories from Chinese folklore that fascinated them. She also proved to be an exceptional cook, teaching Eleanor techniques Eleanor had never encountered. "In my mother's kitchen, we wasted nothing," Sarah explained one evening as she demonstrated how to use every part of a vegetable. "Every scrap had value if you knew how to use it." "That's good wisdom for ranch life too," Eleanor said, watching carefully. "Nothing wasted, everything used." By the following spring, Sarah had become indispensable to the household. She managed the children while Eleanor worked outside, maintained the house with meticulous care, and increasingly took on ranch tasks that freed both Eleanor and Caleb for other work. She'd also begun attending the small church in Bent Creek, where she'd attracted the attention of Marcus Webb, a young blacksmith who'd moved to town the previous year. Eleanor noticed the way Sarah's face softened when Marcus's name was mentioned, the care she took with her appearance on church Sundays. "He's a good man," Eleanor said one afternoon as they worked together in the garden, the children playing nearby. "Marcus. Honest, hardworking, kind." Sarah's cheeks flushed. "He has been very friendly to me." "More than friendly, I'd say. He rode out here last week supposedly to check our horses' shoes, but he spent most of his time talking to you in the kitchen." "Mrs. Turner, I would never, I know my place here is to work, not to—" "Your place here is to build a life," Eleanor interrupted gently. "The work is important, but it's not everything. If you care for Marcus and he cares for you, that's something worth pursuing." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "In San Francisco, no one wanted a Chinese girl. I was told many times I should be grateful for any attention, even from bad men. But Marcus looks at me like I am worth something, like I am a person, not just a worker." Eleanor's chest ached with recognition. She remembered that feeling, the shock of being seen as valuable, as worthy of respect and care. "You are worth something, Sarah. You always were, even when people couldn't see it." Marcus proposed in June, and Sarah accepted with Eleanor and Caleb's blessing. The wedding was small but joyful. held in the Bent Creek Church with the whole community attending. Eleanor watched Sarah walk down the aisle in a dress they'd sewn together and felt the satisfaction of having passed forward the help she'd once received. After the wedding, Sarah and Marcus built a small house in town near the blacksmith shop. Sarah continued to help at the ranch several days a week, but she was building her own life now, her own future. Eleanor missed her daily presence, but rejoiced in her happiness. "You gave her a chance," Caleb said one evening after Sarah had left for the day. "Just like I gave you one." "We gave each other chances," Eleanor corrected. "That's how it works here. People helping people, building something together that none of us could build alone." The ranch continued to prosper through the mid-1880s. The railroad brought better prices for cattle and easier access to supplies. Bent Creek grew into a proper town with a school, a newspaper, and regular church services. The Turners became respected members of the community. Eleanor served on the school board. Caleb advised newer ranchers on water management and grazing practices. But prosperity brought new challenges. Corporate ranching operations were moving into Colorado, buying up vast tracts of land and running massive herds that threatened to overgraze the range. There were tensions over water rights, over grazing boundaries, over the future of independent ranchers like the Turners. One evening in 1886, Tom Brennan rode out to their ranch with troubling news. The Western Cattle Company is buying up everything south of Bent Creek. They've made offers to half a dozen smaller ranchers, and most are selling. They'll control the whole southern range within the year. Caleb's jaw tightened. "They've approached us?" "Not yet, but they will. And when they do, the offer will be generous enough to be tempting. They're paying above market value because they want the water access your property provides." Eleanor felt cold despite the summer heat. "We're not selling." "I didn't think you would," Tom said. "But they won't take no easily. These corporate operations have lawyers and money and patience. They'll find ways to pressure you." He was right. The Western Cattle Company's offer came 2 weeks later, a staggering sum that would have made Eleanor and Caleb wealthy by any standard. They could sell the ranch, move to Denver or San Francisco, live comfortably for the rest of their lives without ever working again. Eleanor read the letter twice, then looked at Caleb across the kitchen table. "What do you think?" "I think they're offering us money to give up everything we've built, everything we are." Caleb's voice was steady, but Eleanor heard the emotion beneath it. "This ranch is more than property to me. It's proof that I could succeed where my father failed, that I could build something lasting. I can't sell that for any price. Even knowing they'll make our lives difficult if we refuse? Especially then. I won't be bullied into giving up what's mine, what's ours." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "But this is your decision too. You came here with nothing. This money could give you security, comfort, everything you never had growing up." Eleanor thought about the Boston boarding house, about the life of genteel poverty and endless sewing. She thought about what she'd gained here: strength, purpose, partnership, children, a community that valued her. She thought about Sarah Chen and the other people who'd come west looking for chances they'd never find back east. "This ranch gave me more than security," Eleanor said quietly. "It gave me a life worth living. I'm not giving that up either." They sent their refusal the next day, polite but firm. The Western Cattle Company responded with increased pressure. They bought up land on 3 sides of the Turner Ranch, tried to block their access to traditional grazing routes, filed complaints about their cattle wandering onto company land. It was harassment designed to wear them down, make them desperate enough to sell. But the Turners had faced worse than corporate bullying. They'd survived blizzards and drought, personal loss and economic hardship. They knew how to endure. Other small ranchers rallied around them, recognizing that if the Turners fell, they'd all eventually fall to corporate consolidation. They formed a cooperative to share resources and present a united front. They hired their own lawyer to fight the legal harassment. They supported each other through the difficult years when beef prices dropped and expenses rose. Eleanor found herself taking on leadership roles she'd never anticipated. She organized meetings of ranch wives to coordinate household economies, served as spokesperson when negotiating with cattle buyers, used the literacy and business skills from her Boston days to help neighbors who struggled with paperwork and contracts. "You've become quite the frontier woman," Martha Brennan said one afternoon. watching Eleanor chair a contentious meeting about water rights with calm authority. Remember when you first arrived, so scared you could barely speak to a cow without trembling? Eleanor laughed. I remember. Sometimes I can barely believe that was me. It feels like a different person, a different life. It was. You've been reborn out here, Eleanor, made yourself into something new and better. The struggle with the Western Cattle Company reached its climax in the winter of 1888. The company had managed to purchase the land controlling the main access route to winter pasture, effectively trying to strangle the Turners and their cooperative allies. They were offering one final buyout, accept or face economic ruin. The meeting to discuss the offer was held at the Turner Ranch, the main room packed with ranchers and their wives, tension thick enough to cut. If we sell, we lose everything we've built, Caleb said, standing before the assembled group. Our independence, our way of life, our futures. But if we fight and lose, we lose everything anyway, plus we've bankrupted ourselves in the process. There's another option, Eleanor said, standing to join her husband. All eyes turned to her. We could approach the territorial legislature about establishing legal grazing corridors that can't be blocked by private ownership. Other states have done it, created public right-of-ways for traditional cattle routes. That would take months, maybe years, someone objected. Then we survive for months or years. We've done it before. Eleanor's voice was strong, carrying to every corner of the room. I came to this country with $17 and no idea how to survive. This room is full of people who came with nothing and built something anyway. We're all still here because we refused to quit when things got hard. I say we don't start quitting now. The vote was unanimous. They would fight. The battle for grazing rights took 2 hard years. The cooperative ranchers pooled resources to hire lobbyists, sent delegations to the territorial capital, built alliances with other agricultural interests. Eleanor traveled to Denver 3 times, leaving the children with Sarah and Marcus, to testify before legislative committees about the importance of protecting independent ranchers. She stood in marble-floored government buildings wearing her best dress, still practical by Eastern standards but respectable enough, and spoke truth to politicians who'd never worked a day on the land they were legislating. Small ranchers are the backbone of Colorado's economy and character, Eleanor told one committee. We're not asking for handouts or special treatment. We're asking for fair access to land that's been used for grazing since before any corporation existed. We're asking for the right to continue the lives we've built with our own sweat and sacrifice. The legislation passed in the spring of 1890, establishing protected grazing corridors and limiting corporate control over traditional routes. The Western Cattle Company, faced with the new restrictions and the stubborn resistance of the cooperative ranchers, finally gave up its harassment campaign and focused on consolidating the land it already controlled. The Turners and their allies had won, though the victory was exhausting and expensive. But they'd proven something important: that determination and community could stand against even corporate power, that the frontier spirit that had built Colorado in the first place wasn't dead yet. Eleanor was 42 years old the summer the grazing rights victory was finalized, and she felt every one of those years in her bones. She'd gone gray early, her hands were permanently scarred from work, and her body bore the marks of childbearing and hard labor. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw someone she was proud to be. Strong, capable, respected in her community. Rose was 14 now, tall and serious like her father, but with her mother's fierce determination. She could ride as well as any cowboy, manage household accounts, and had recently announced her intention to attend the new teachers' college in Denver. James, 12, was quieter, but shared his father's gift with animals and already talked about expanding the ranch's horse breeding program. The children Caleb and Eleanor had made together would have choices their parents never had. They could stay or go, work the ranch, or build different lives, but they'd do it from a foundation of security and possibility that Eleanor and Caleb had fought to create. One evening in late August, Eleanor and Caleb sat on the porch watching the sunset over their land. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The house they'd built stood solid behind them, and the future stretched ahead with the kind of certainty that came from having weathered every storm and emerged intact. 12 years, Eleanor said quietly. 12 years since I stood on that train platform in Bent Creek, terrified and alone. 12 years since I met a city woman who didn't know a cow from a horse and decided to teach her anyway, Caleb replied, his arm around her shoulders. Why did you? Eleanor asked, a question she'd never quite voiced directly. Why did you help me? You could have let me fail, bought the ranch cheap, expanded your own operation. Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering. Because you reminded me of myself when I first came west. Lost and scared, but trying anyway, and because your uncle had helped me when I was in the same situation. It seemed right to pass that forward. He pulled her closer. Best decision I ever made. Teaching you gave me a partner, a love, a family. Everything I have now started with that choice to help instead of exploit. We helped each other, Eleanor said, echoing her words from years earlier. That's what this whole life has been about. People helping each other, building something together that's stronger than what any of us could build alone. 3 years later, in the spring of 1893, a young woman stepped off the train in Bent Creek, carrying a single carpet bag and a look of desperate determination that Eleanor recognized instantly. She was perhaps 20, thin from hunger or hardship, her clothes respectable but worn, her eyes holding that particular combination of fear and stubborn hope that Eleanor remembered so well. Eleanor had come to town that day to collect supplies and happened to be at the station when the train arrived. She watched the young woman look around the platform with visible dismay, clearly having expected someone to meet her who hadn't appeared. Eleanor approached slowly, remembering how frightening everything had been when she'd first arrived. "Excuse me, miss. Are you lost?" The young woman turned and Eleanor saw tears threatening in her eyes. "I was supposed to meet Mr. Harrison about a position as a school teacher, but there's no one here and I don't know where to go." "Harrison runs the general store. He's probably just running late. He's notoriously bad about keeping time." Eleanor smiled reassuringly. "I'm Eleanor Turner. I live on a ranch northeast of town. Why don't you come with me to the store and we'll find Mr. Harrison together?" Relief flooded the young woman's face. "Thank you. I'm Rebecca Walsh from Philadelphia. I'm afraid I don't know anything about Colorado or frontier towns or any of this, really." "None of us did when we first arrived," Eleanor said gently, taking Rebecca's bag. "But you learn. The frontier teaches everyone who's willing to pay attention." As they walked toward the general store, Eleanor found herself telling Rebecca her own story, arriving alone and terrified, learning to ranch, building a life from nothing. She saw Rebecca's expression shift from fear to fascination to hope as the story unfolded. "You really did all that?" Rebecca asked. "Learned to run a ranch in just months?" "With help," Eleanor emphasized. "That's the most important thing I learned. Accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And when you're established, you help the next person who needs it." They found Mr. Harrison at the store, profusely apologetic about missing the train. He explained that the teaching position came with a small house, but Rebecca would need to furnish it herself and wouldn't receive her first pay for a month. Eleanor saw Rebecca's face fall, saw her calculating whether her limited funds could stretch that far. She made a decision that felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Rebecca can stay with us until the house is ready and she's settled," Eleanor said firmly. "We have room, and it'll give her time to learn about the community and prepare for teaching. No arguments," she added when Rebecca tried to protest. "Consider it a frontier welcome." And so the cycle continued. Rebecca stayed with the Turners for 3 weeks, learning about Colorado life from Eleanor and the children, receiving the same kind of patient teaching and support that Eleanor had once received. When she moved into the schoolhouse, she did so with confidence and connections, ready to succeed instead of merely survive. She wasn't the last. Over the years that followed, Eleanor and Caleb became known as people who helped newcomers transition to frontier life. They took in a young widow with 2 children who'd lost her husband to illness on the trail west. They helped a former slave family navigate the hostility they faced from some settlers and find land they could homestead. They provided temporary work and housing for countless others who arrived with more determination than resources. "You've built something beyond just a ranch," Martha Brennan said during one visit, watching Eleanor help yet another struggling newcomer. "You've built a legacy of kindness." "I'm just passing forward what was given to me," Eleanor said. But she knew Martha was right. The ranch was prosperous, yes, but that prosperity meant nothing if they hoarded it selfishly. The real measure of success was in how many lives they touched, how many people they helped find their own strength and belonging. Rose eventually married a Denver lawyer and became a fierce advocate for women's property rights, using her ranch upbringing to inform her legal work. James took over the main ranch operations when Caleb's health began to decline in his 60s, running it with the same practical wisdom his parents had shown. Both children married and had families of their own, bringing grandchildren who spent summers on the ranch learning the same lessons about resilience and community that Eleanor and Caleb had learned decades earlier. Eleanor lived to be 73 years old, dying peacefully in the house she and Caleb had built, surrounded by children and grandchildren and the visible evidence of a life extraordinarily well lived. Caleb followed her 6 months later, unable or unwilling to exist without his partner of 4 decades. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their shared gravestone simple but accurate. Eleanor and Caleb Turner. They built something lasting. But the real legacy wasn't the ranch, though it continued to prosper under James's management and eventually his daughters. It wasn't the money or the land or the cattle, though all of those were considerable. The real legacy was in the changed lives. In Sarah Chen Webb, who went from a desperate laundry worker to a respected member of the Bent Creek community. In Rebecca Walsh, who taught school for 35 years and educated 2 generations of Colorado children. In the dozens of others who arrived lost and afraid and found, through the Turners' help, the strength to build futures they'd never dreamed possible. It was in the practice of helping that Eleanor had learned from Caleb and passed forward to everyone she met. The understanding that survival in hard country required community, that strength came from supporting each other, that the frontier was built not by rugged individuals, but by people brave enough to accept and offer help. Years after Eleanor's death, an elderly woman visited the ranch asking to speak with someone from the Turner family. James, himself in his 70s by then, came out to meet her. "I don't know if you remember me," the woman said. "My name is Sarah Webb. I worked for your parents many years ago." James smiled, recognition dawning. "Sarah, of course I remember. You used to tell us stories and make those wonderful dumplings." "Your mother gave me a life," Sarah said simply. "I came here with nothing, expecting nothing, and she treated me like family. She taught me that I was worth something, that I could be strong. When she died, I wanted to come pay my respects, but I was too ill to travel. I've come now to say thank you, even though it's too late for her to hear it." "It's not too late," James said gently. "The things my mother built don't die just because she did. Every person she helped carries forward her legacy. That includes you, Sarah." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I've tried to live the way she lived, helping others when I could, being kind, refusing to give up when things were hard. I wanted to honor what she gave me." "Then you have," James said. "That's exactly what she would have wanted." And it was true. Eleanor Turner had arrived in Colorado as a frightened seamstress, fleeing slow death in a Boston boarding house. She'd left the world as a woman who'd built not just a successful ranch, but a legacy of transformation, proof that strength could be learned, that community mattered more than individual achievement, that the frontier's greatest promise wasn't wealth or freedom, but the chance to become someone entirely new. She'd claimed more than an inheritance when she'd accepted that ranch 12 years into her journey west. She'd claimed a future, a family, a place in the world where her life had meaning beyond mere survival. She'd proven that the seemingly impossible, learning an entirely new way of living, building love in hard country, creating lasting change in a harsh environment, was absolutely possible for anyone brave enough and stubborn enough to try. The ranch still stood, generations later, a living testament to what 2 people could build when they chose partnership over independence, community over isolation, persistence over surrender. And somewhere in its bones, in the very wood and stone and earth of it, Eleanor's spirit remained, welcoming, teaching, helping, always reminding newcomers that they too could transform if they were willing to do the work and accept the help offered along the way. The frontier had tested Eleanor Hale Turner and found her worthy. But more importantly, Eleanor had tested the frontier and found it could be shaped, could be softened, could be made into a home for anyone determined enough to claim it. That was her true inheritance, and it would last as long as the mountains themselves stood watch over the wide Colorado sky.